please, if you have any comments, I also want to say that there will be plenty of time in the end for some discussion, and you're of course always welcome to reach out to VideoMeter and ask any questions you have about our software and our toolboxes. So the thing that we're going to get into today is advanced MSI, so multispectral imaging, and especially how we use transformations to solve a variety of problems. I just want to go over briefly what transformations are, and then we'll get into depth about the 3 different main methods that we have in our system and how we apply those to common use cases. And finally, I'll also go over some ways of getting the most out of your transformations, what kind of tips and tricks there are to set them up, how to analyze the output of the data, and how to really get the best results. I want to note that today that we'll be using the new transformation builder, but there's also the old transformation builder that's still available in our software, and many of the methods still apply equally well. So, first of all, VideoMeter, of course, just as a brief mention of who we are. We specialize in multispectral imaging. We're about 25 years old, and most of our systems are lab instruments. We also have worked with turnkey inline systems running 24/7, and we also do R&D projects for any problems that you might have. Done more than 700 imaging R&D projects since 2000, inline spectral imaging since 2002, and recently we've been focusing a lot on our lab instruments, ready packaged for solving any kind of imaging problems. Based in Copenhagen, Denmark, partnerships worldwide. So let's first start talking about what is a transformation in this context, because I don't think it's something that we usually think about when we talk about image transformations. It's like, what does this really mean? But there is actually some somewhat common relation to something we understand in our real life, and of course transformation means to take something and put it into another form, and that's really the fundamental aspect. We're trying to take our image data, which is in one form that might be intuitive or might be easy to measure, and then we take that data and put it into a form that's much more applicable to whatever domain or problem it is that we're working with. And this is then where we have to think about what kind of transformation makes sense for the kind of problem that we are working with. Usually, when we talk about transformations of light, we might usually on computers operate with red, green, and blue spectra, or red, green, and blue bands. That is a transformation, right? Because light in real life consists of wavelengths that can be mostly any wavelength that we decide and any intensity we decide, but we transform that into some space that consists of the red, green, and blue components, because that's how our eyes mostly perceive color, to some approximation. But we don't really think of the world in terms of red, green, and blue, right? We also understand that there's purple, that there's yellow. So in other contexts, it makes sense to think about color in a different way. Quite common in terms of at least photo and image processing is to think about it in terms of hue, saturation, and value, where the hue is then approximately what kind of color, if it's red, green, blue, purple, etc. And saturation is then how vibrant that color is, how far away from gray or white or black you could say that color is. And then you have the value, that's the intensity, which is the black and white scale. Now, why this scale is interesting compared to red, green, and blue is that this is often a more intuitive scale for humans, because we can think about, well, this color is very, very dull, that means it's close to gray, that means it has a very low saturation. Or we could talk about it being very, very bright, and then we say that it has a high value. Or we talk about whether or not it's very red, or very yellow, or very blue, and then that determines something about the angle on the hue scale. So in this situation, it's common for example, a photo editor or designer to talk about hue, saturation, and value instead of red, green, and blue. but they're both transformations of the actual color data that would be represented in real life. And to just illustrate that there are many different sensory transformations that we could talk about just in terms of color and human perception of color. There's the CIE lab, which is very well known in terms of perceived color spaces. There are two different versions, but common to both of them is that they try to approximate that any movement within this space corresponds to an equal change in how people perceive the color. So it tries to map something that is very close to how humans interpret colors. So all these three are transformations of color into some kind of more intuitive or more practical space. But of course, in our operations, in some type of quality control, in some kind of research aspect, we're not necessarily interested in what saturation of color is, what value it is, what red it is. That might be a proxy for something, but that's not our end result. What we're interested in is, for example, is this color part of the background, or is this pixel part of the background, or is it part of the seed that we are trying to measure and segment out? Is this pixel part of something that's been burned, or is it part of something that's been undamaged? Is this something that's coded or uncoded? Is this essentially good or bad? And this might not seem like a color aspect, and it somewhat isn't, but it's still a transformation aspect. It's just that instead of talking about a color space, we're more talking about a problem space where we try to map onto a domain where we then get colors that are useful for the problems we're trying to solve. And all transformations in terms of video meter lab of what we are working with, in terms of the lower for how do we map whatever multispectral images that we take onto some kind of solution or problem space where a certain value has a correspondence to the kind of problem that we are trying to solve. And this is how we then build up the various transformations that we can supply. So essentially, transformations allow us to express images in terms of the applications that we are trying to solve, rather than just thinking purely about colors or single wavelengths. Instead, we can work directly on the problem, rather than being too hung up about physical aspects or details of the computer implementation. The three problems that we usually try to do transformation, the three applications that we have, are measurement, which is, for example, to measure how big a ratio or percentage of something has a certain property. It might be the segmentation of how do we distinguish something from the background and foreground. And then finally, it could be classification, where essentially we use aspects of measurement and segmentation to, for example, determine geometric or physical properties like geometry or color properties on the surface. And these are the kind of three problems where we want to design transformations that are useful to understand and easy to interpret, and also highlights and gives good contrast on the data that we want to use. So the agenda is how and why do we pick various methods for solving our problems in transformations? And the second is how can we improve and understand the results specifically of the nCDA transformation, which is our flagship and most powerful transformation that we supply in our package. All this is part of the multispectral imaging toolbox that we provide as part of Video Meter Lab. We have transformations for principal component analysis, which is the reference standard for many applications, but not necessarily the most useful for image analysis. Minimum noise fractions, which is I will talk about all these, of course, but minimum noise fraction, which is useful for explorative and unknown versus unknown problems. Mahalanobis distance, which is technically not a transform but a metric, but it measures distances and allows you to work with problems with unknown properties. And then the canonical discriminant analysis, CDA or nCDA, which allows you to do classifications of pixels against known classes. Upon these, we could build segmentation sequences, pixel classifiers. We have a whole library of these you can build up and combine in various ways for whatever problems you have. So to give a 10,000 feet overview of what transformations to pick and how to approach it. Known class versus known class. So you have two cases where you know, for example, good seed and bad seed, background versus foreground. You would pick the nCDA method. It allows you to separate out a new band. You create essentially a new image with a new band. And on one axis, you have the one class, and on the other axis, you have your other class. If you only know something about the object that you're trying to measure or the background, but you don't know about, you have uncertainty about what other things might be in the images you take, the Mahalanobis distance allows you to work with one class and then measure distances to unknown classes. So if you only know of one class in your set and don't know what else might appear, Mahalanobis is the one to go for. And finally, we have unknown versus unknown cases where you don't know what you're looking for, but you want to explore or look for new options. MNF is the tool of choice. It allows you to highlight areas of interest and explore without any filtering. So one way I also think about these is that the nCDA is kind of like a judge. It makes a decision, either determines if something is good or bad. It essentially puts it into classes. It is continuous, but it does make a separation. You might, in the other cases, you have Mahalanobis, which acts a little bit like a security guard. It checks the ID of various pixels in the image and only lets those through which live up to a certain requirement. And finally, you have the detective that just goes out and explores and finds anything suspicious or interesting. And this is also revealed in the thresholding that we typically use when building a segmentation. nCDA splits things around mean 0 and then infinite, plus and minus on other sides. Mahalanobis goes from 0 to infinity, where 0 means that it's very, very close to known class. And MNF doesn't really have a proper definition of what kind of separations usually make sense. Good. So now we'll get into the meat of it, about how we do this. And first, just a brief primer on the linear transformations. So essentially, the problem is that we have some kind of spread of data, and we want to project that down into fewer dimensions. And one dimension could be one band of an image. So with RGB images, we would have 3. With multi-spectral images, we could have 48 or more. But we want to condense that down to one dimension that just tells us whether something is good or bad, or close or distant. And the way we do this is that we essentially take this string or vector of numbers that is each pixel, and then we put some weights on loadings, they're also called in this context, and get a weighted sum, and that's what this A transposed times X does. It produces the projection of our data. And the whole idea about this is to figure out what weights to put on each band in our image to produce a good projection. And this is essentially the only thing to think about in terms of this with linear projections, is that we're trying to pick good weights that produce the properties that we are interested in the output image. And the reason why it's worth to go a little bit through the mathematics of this is it understands how we come to the decision about using these different methods. What we are interested in usually is that we have some kind of signal that we assume is an image, and we have some noise. And we want to make the distinction between the signal and the noise as big as possible. And the way we can formulate this is through this sigma, which is the dispersion or covariance of the signal, and dispersion and, sorry, I'll just put on my pointer. Dispersion and covariance of the noise. And by multiplying these together, in this way, we can then get a ratio of what's the average or the total variance divided by the total noise variance we have in this. And we get this coefficient called the Rayleigh quotient. And when we have this expression, we can reformulate this into another problem that's easy to solve, but we have to start here to understand what kind of problem it is that we're solving. And to go about designing our solution, we want to maximize the distinction between the signal that we have and the noise we have. So we want RA to be as big as possible. And by multiplying on both sides, we can come down to this expression where we have some kind of segment multiplied with some weights should be equal to the noise covariance with the weights and some factor. And we want this factor to be as big as possible. And it turns out that when we express it in this way, it looks very much like something called an eigenvalue problem. And this is very well studied for those who are not familiar with this concept, and it allows us to use general and very powerful methods to get good results. Essentially, we get a signal-to-noise ratio, which tells us how good our separation is. We get a loading vector, which tells us how we get that separation of the data. And then all that's left now is to figure out how do we formulate our signal covariance and our noise covariance in order to get the method that we're interested in. The first example we have of this is that we want to distinguish known data. We wish to essentially get the maximum spread of the variance, or the maximum variance or maximum spread between the classes in our output. But we know we have one class, one set of pixels with a set of data points, and we have another set of data points that we also know. And we want to make sure that whatever happens in our output, those two sets of data points get as far away from each other as possible. So that means that the covariance in our top should be as large as possible. At the same time, we are also interested in that the variance of the classes of the data within our classes, within these points, these two data sets, are as small as possible, so that they're very narrow, so that they don't overlap with the other class. Right? If we look at the picture here, we can see that this is one set of values for one class and the set of values for another class. Of course, only seen from in a 2D plot. And we want this distance, or the spread of this, to be as small as possible, to have the smallest possible overlap, to make sure that there's no confusion in output between the green class and the red class. And that means that this gets as small as possible, which of course, if we look at the quotient here, it also means that this entire expression gets very large. So we want to maximize the variance among the classes, and we want to minimize the variance within the classes. And this is the design criteria for how we want to make this kind of optimization. And this is what is then expressed as the nCDA. And now I want to go over to VideoMeter and demonstrate what that means. So I want to take in a photo here I have of some washers. It's just going to load. So the first case I want to work is that I want to separate out these washers from the background of the image. And the way we can do this is that we can go in and go to MSI, transformation, and now I'll pick the new transformation builder. You can also pick the transformation builder, but I will pick a new one today. We'll get up this image. It's organized into two columns for those who are not familiar. The first column is concerned with the input data. The second column is concerned with the method, and it selects nCDA as the standard. And we see that we have to work with some layers. So we have to work, right now the red and green layers are selected, so we'll pick those. And these are essentially our classes. So I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. And I'm going to start by painting. And I'm just going to pick a good brush size. And I will just go around and paint a little bit to make sure that I capture the variance of the various pixels I have in my case. So I think that's a pretty good sample of the washes. And now I'll pick the green layer. And now I'll paint the background. So again, I'll just capture a few different cases of the background. Also make sure to get some of the dark pixels and get some of the black border. And all there is now is essentially just to click train, calculate this for a little bit, and we can see a little preview of the result here. We can see the Rayleigh coefficient is here. It's a very large ratio. We can see it's good separation. And I can also get a larger preview by clicking this apply button. And what we get here is an image of the transform space. You can see that it only has a single band, which is the band that essentially tells if something is in the background or it's the washer in the foreground. So very good for these cases where we want to separate two different classes. So as we can see, it looks like we get a pretty clean separation, but we go into the image, go in the color bar, and then we can see that the red colors are something that corresponds to the washer, and the blue colors is something that corresponds to the background. So it looks like it is a pretty clean separation of the two classes. So this is the case of what we can do with nCDA. It allows us to do this separation. Of course, this is perhaps a very simple example of just telling if the washer is somewhat wide or not. So let's pick something more interesting. Just going to close this and go back. And I'm going to pick out this image of oilseed rape. And we're just going to see. So what we have here is that I have all these oilseeds, and I noticed that some of them are slightly more red in color and slightly more brown. And I wonder if I could get a color space, a transformation that highlights this difference. I go in, again, I paint. So I just paint a bit on some of the dark ones. That seems to be, these seems to be representative of the very dark ones. And then we'll go in and find the more reddish brown ones. I think this one is good. This is also a very good example. Over here we have another one. And I think actually that's where we're going to go. So of course this was a very slight difference in the pixels. And when we run it now, we get a picture where it then separates the very dark OSR seeds from the very reddish ones. Now, this is actually a little annoying because it's difficult to really see what's going on. So I'm going to show you a little trick. You go up to the mask here and then click blue background. Then it tries to calculate a good mask that picks out the foreground objects away from the blue belt. And this carries over when we click apply. So now it's much easier to see what is going on. And suddenly we see that, if we zoom in a little bit, that these slight differences in color between various objects are suddenly brought up to much higher contrast, and it allows us to make it much easier, for example, to pick out interesting objects or do some calculations on this. So these are just two examples of how we can use nCDA to highlight various differences in a data set. Good. The next method that we can work with is, or the next issue that we work with, is what happens if we only know about one class in our data set, but don't know the other. So known versus unknown. And essentially we are having kind of the same problem as before, except how do we formulate this? Well, the thing is that when we talk about this is that we want to measure distance to some kind of known data set. Like we want to figure out, well, I have this data set of what is my known data, and if I get some new data, what's the distance to this? And we could measure just a simple linear distance, but the problem is that then we don't really account for distribution. Let's see this example, for example, here. The blue and the red star are both placed close to the edge of where this distribution is. But if we look at the distance, we see that the red is much further away in terms of just the as the crow flies distance, and the blue is shorter. But are they closer because of the stretch and the distance to the actual edge of the distribution? Well, what we do is that we go in using something, we can use a variety of methods in Video Meter Lab, but usually we use MNF, which I'll talk about briefly, but we essentially try to estimate what does this distribution look like. And then we apply the inverse of the covariance to this distribution, which essentially makes it much more uniform, or at least it makes it more uniform in the solution space, and it also transforms our input data. So suddenly we can compare the points, even though that they might not be close enough to the center of the data. They are closely related to how the data is distributed. And what this means for our use case is that we can go in, mark up data where we know this is what our data set usually looks like, and then we can see how other unknown data sets map onto this, or project onto this. So I'm working again before with the example of the blue background. I'll take the maze example in this case. And what we're interested here, I'll do two things. One is that, let's say I want to make a generic way of picking out my maze. For example, I know that some of my maze are quite brown, some of them are more yellow, some of them are a bit damaged, and I only really want to pick out the background from this. So what I can do is that I go in, just make sure my layers are selected properly, and I paint on the background of my image. And I also paint a little bit on the edge to also get that. I go over and I select the nMahalanobis, known versus unknown, and I deselect only the select, so I only have the red layer. And when I then train this, it tries to find a distribution a transformation that can measure the distance to something that looks like the background. And you see here in the preview, it looks pretty good. And when I apply it, we see that it essentially picks out the maze cones from the background. So something about thresholding with this is that you have to be a little bit careful about where is the threshold, because this dark part might be a little bit confused about it. But in many cases, this is a good way to work with unknown data where you want to pick out, because you see the blue belt and the black edges are essentially gone in this case. One trick that I use to figure out if my transformation is good without going through the segmentation builder, I go into scale settings. I'll just show again. Go into scale settings, go to the fixed value, and then I turn this down to something I might use in the segmentation builder. So let's say 3. Let's see. And now we can see that here we can at least pick out all the maze. It might even be too much. We can try and put it to 4. And here we can really see that the background, that the maze are really getting picked up on this. They are very, very distinct from the background. We can also do something else. We saw before that, I'm just going to clear all the paint area here. We saw before that we could mask out the background, and I'm going to do that again. And what I will be interested in now is I kind of just want to measure, well, how different are various colors on the image from this yellow part on a maze cone. So I paint this out, and I go around and we'll paint a little bit of another one. And then we train. this is a bit dark. I'll just try and switch. Let's find a good view mode where it's very visible. Yeah. So what we see is, of course, that the parts that we painted get values very close to 0, and the white parts get a very good highlight. And interestingly also, like the damaged part on this grain, of course, is also highlights out as being very, very distant from this distribution. But we also notice, for example, on this seed there's a little blemish, and that is also getting highlighted. So it's also something that could be an interesting method where you know a little bit about the surface properties to look for something interesting in the surface. But we'll also look into a different method for that. But I just want to say that sometimes it can be good to use the Mahalanobis distance also to explore data. Yes. The final method that we want to talk about, the final problem that we want to talk about, is unknown versus unknown. This is the case where we don't know what we're looking for in our data set. So, for example, we have no idea, we get some sample that we're unsure about, we have some surface we are unsure about, or it might be a case where it's difficult to paint in what it is that we're interested in looking for, but we know that there is something. Essentially, it's the same idea as nCDA. We are trying to figure out a way of increasing signal-to-noise ratio in our image, but in this case, we don't know about the classes, so we have to use a different strategy. What we do is something called noise widening, and this requires that we do not need any painting, but we also don't get a separation that is deterministic. Of course, the transformation is a calculation, it works every time, but we have to analyze the data, and then we use the data in the image to figure out what transformation to make. First, the noise is estimated, and then we do a principal component analysis, which looks for major axes of change and variance in the image. And we use that to remove noise from the main image. So essentially, we go in and figure out what are some, we make a good estimate of what the noise is, figure out how the noise looks, and then subtracts that or removes that from the image. And then on the main image, we then, where we have denoised, we then use principal component analysis again to find the largest signal-to-noise ratios that are then left in the image. And what this allows us for is to find really, really fine details. So for example, here are some scorched particles and some powder, and suddenly the contrast is dramatically enhanced. I'm going to show this with an example. So I have an image of some powder that has some defects in it. One of the defects is already really easy to notice. We have one here, but we know that there could be other defects, and we don't want to accidentally paint over them or mistake them for anything. So we go up to methods and pick MNF, unknown versus unknown. Use full image. We can change how we do the noise estimation. Mean is the default. We can also do median, but we'll just stick with the defaults. Run train. And it takes a little while to analyze because it has to analyze the entire image and figure out a good way of doing this separation and producing new images. It produces an image with as many bands as the input, and each band is then ordered by the most interesting aspects, or essentially the best signal-to-noise ratio. So I'm just applying that. And the first band that we get, is usually the content of whatever we're picturing versus the background. So it's usually not very interesting. It could maybe be useful for segmentation problems, but typically not very interesting. The second one we get, I'm just stepping through the layers. The second one is then the one with the second highest signal-to-noise ratio. And not really anything particular here, but as we step in, we start to see that there is something that is picked out in terms of this blemish. And as we go in, we can see that there are also other things that are picked out and noticed. So we really see that this is a a quite useful method for actually going in and detecting very slight, very slight changes in a data set where we are unsure about what we are looking for. So we could, for example, use this to actually make a measurement method. We could use this transformation on this band, the fourth band, and perhaps also on the fifth band, to actually detect these slightly brown specks in this powder. And that could then be a transformation that we could use for whatever application is we're interested in. As we go through the bands, there starts to be less and less signal in the image, and it starts to become more and more noisy until we get down to the final band, and then it is essentially just complete noise. So that's the MNF method, the final method we use. So just to highlight again, or give a good reminder, we have the issue of known classes versus known classes with nCDA. Unknown, when you have a known class but don't know what context it will show up in, use nMahalanobis. It's the good choice for doing these kind of problems. And if you're exploring or unsure what you're looking for, it's difficult to paint or classify. Explore it using MNF and then build classifiers upon that later when you have more data. For the final part of this presentation, I will go over some of my tips for getting the most out of your nCDA. And I have 3 tips. Paint at the boundaries, not the center. Paint where there's confusion, not certainty. And finally, reduce band usage for faster imaging. So I'll go through these, and then there'll be some time for questions if there are any. So the first about paint at the boundaries, not the center, is essentially related to the formulation of nCDA. And this is why it's a little bit important or very nice to actually know something about the mathematical basis of it. Remember that the idea of nCDA is that we are trying to maximize the variance between classes. But the formulation for the top of our, I mixed the colors on this. The formulation for the top of this quotient is that we minimize the variance within a class. That means that if your data is very, very spread out within a class, it will try to squeeze it in around -1 and +1 on the output. But for most segmentation problems, we are actually not concerned whether it's close to -1 and +1. We are interested in whether it's far away from the other class we're interested in. I'll give an example of this in video. I'll give an example with the washes. So we'll load it in, change to nCDA, and get ready to paint. I'm going to show just how little painting is needed to get a good transformation. Just by being picky around what it is that we are painting for. Because it's the boundary between 2 classes that's the interesting thing. And in this case, it's the transition between the blue background and the washer. If I go in and pick a very, very, very small pencil, pick the red class, and I just paint like this here, and then I take the green one and I just paint just outside with where the blue belt is. I click this, excuse me, and run it. Like, this is so little data, and it's such an odd place, right? I don't even paint inside, I don't even capture everything related to the belt. But if we look at the output of the transformation, we see that it's, apart from the edges, we see that it actually separates the washers quite well. And maybe we can do a bit better. Like, we notice that at the boundaries, it's somewhat confusing it with the where the shadows are. So we can go in and just paint a little more green here where the boundary is. Retrain. and suddenly it's a lot better. Like, the difference is dramatic between these two, right? Look at this. Right, just by painting at the boundaries. The last point also about this is that we can look at this picture and see where the colors are like green cyan, and that's where the confusion is for the transformation. Those are the places where we should go in and paint. Those are the places where we get the more out of our transformation, because that's where we want the separation to happen. We don't really care about additional separation within the washers or on the actual blue belt, because these places the transformation is also already very, very certain about the two classes. So we also have this edge here. We can see that the edge of the conveyor is classified as a washer. So I'm just going to paint a single drop of the paint on this. Right, just going to go up here. I'm just going to do one little green dot. I think it's 5 pixels or something like that. And we're going to retrain. Right, and we would imagine that that would not make a big difference. This is just 5 more points. But the important thing is that these 5 points add so much information because of what they do to the variance of the data. Right? They really show that the background data set is spread out across this blue and black parts, really, really spread out. And suddenly we can see that we actually also get the blue background in. See some more confusion in the corner, and we could work on with this. Right, but it really illustrates that it's not about painting a lot. It's not about painting everywhere. It's about finding the key places where to paint, and those are the edges and where there's confusion. Good. So those were 2 of my tricks. Paint at the boundaries, not the center, and then paint where there's confusion, not certainty. Good. The final thing I want to show is how to also work a little bit with the band data that we have in our transformations. And I'll do that, and that's something that's available in the new transformation tool. So if we look over here, we see the transformation results. We see that there's a setting here called band selection. And this is also somewhat visible in the old one, but I'll show some tricks. And what we see in this is that we can see all the bands that are used by this transformation to get the output. But what's interesting about this band selection chart is that we see that already with 2 bands or 4 bands or 3 bands, we have like 100 times separation between the between the washer and the background, right? Just after 3 or 4 bands. And instead of capturing 19 bands with our camera, we could maybe reduce that to 3 bands, 4 bands, 5 bands or something like that. And we could get dramatically faster imaging and still do the segmentation that we're interested in. So for some applications, it might make sense to do fewer bands. What we can do is we can select here and select, let's take 3 bands. And we see that it's 365 nanometers, 850, and 970 nanometers. I'm going to go up to MSI Toolbox, Transformation, New Transformation Builder. We can have a second one. And I'm going to use this called Use Band Subset. And here I can then go in and pick the 365, the 850, and 970. Let's see if it works. Right. So we get a new transformation that performs as well, most as well as some normalization stuff we can include here. But we get a new transformation that performs a very, very good separation between the washer and the background, even though it only uses 3 bands. So we get much faster imaging, much faster image processing also. So this is something to look into if you're interested in optimizing your analysis time, reducing the amount of data you have to work with. You can go in and you can figure out what bands actually contribute the most to your data. Yeah, okay. So that essentially ends the planned presentation part. So now we have a few minutes if somebody has some questions about our toolbox, if someone is interested in having something demonstrated. Yeah, and welcome to write a comment if you want to speak or something. Very good, Thomas. Happy to hear that it's useful. Oh, it's very late. Good night then. Great. Well, happy that you found it useful.